It is about Աղետ and Shoah, about Armenian genocide and Holocaust, historical developments in comparison. And the lecturer is Dr. Christin Pichholz. She works in Lepsiushaus, and at the same time she teaches at the chair of military history, cultural history of violence at the University of Pottsdammi.
It's a great honor for me. I started the job at the Lepsiushaus in 2014, and it was always an aim to visit Armenia and Yerevan. I know Professor Hayuni already at that time, and I couldn't go because of family reasons. My children are very small still, so it's a very special moment for me to talk here, and it was very special to be in Yerevan. So I'd like to thank you that you joined this talk today. Okay, but I will start. The topic today, Dan Stone pointed out that the comparative study of the historical figure of genocide would be a case of unequal development. And regarding to my subject today, on Shoah, historical developments and comparison, it is the case too. And there are two reasons in particular. The historiography of the Holocaust is of considerable scope, and no scholar is in a position to read all of it. And research on the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire does not come close to this, even though it has increased strongly over the last 20 years. The second reason are the political and social preconditions in which scholars in the perpetrator societies could work. Despite this inequality, I would like to attempt to treat comparative aspects not with a summary of both historiographical developments, that would be maybe a little bit boring, but rather to highlight some interfaces. I will refer strongly to the historiography in Germany and Turkey in order to characterize some developments more precisely. And in my talk, I would like to focus on 4 points. First of all, I will focus to the political and social conditions in which the previous wars, I mean the First and the Second World War, is narrated. Secondly, I will focus on the historical view in the immediate post-war period. The third point then deals with the longer-term development of historiography, in which I also illuminate contemporary historical research as a scholarship of state legitimation. And point 4 deals with the influence of the field of genocide studies on research on Holocaust and the Armenian genocide. So let us therefore begin with the different preconditions for the founding of states after the mass violence. And the question is, how were the wars during which the genocide took place contextualized? And let us begin with a look at the defeat of Germany in 1945. So I will always switch between Germany and Turkey now. In May 1945, the weapons finally remained silent, and the High Command of the German Wehrmacht signed the declaration of surrender. The results of the Second World War, which started from German ground, more than 60 million people died and more than 6 million European Jews were murdered. Thousands of Sinti and Roma, people with disabilities, political dissenters, and homosexuals were persecuted and killed. Large parts of Europe were destroyed, and the Holocaust could only be carried out under the conditions of war. The social post-war reality with the destroyed cities in Germany after the Allied airstrikes and people's own experience of violence created social conditions in Germany, however, with which many people could also assume the role of victims, whether displaced persons and evacuees, returnees, or denazification victims. victims, they had one thing in common. They saw themselves as victims of Nazi regime and war. And Neil Gregor, for example, shows in his research this on the example of the German city Nuremberg. There is, of course, the Cold War and the numerous personal Nazi continuities, but Gregor also shows that this attitude of being a victim covered up compassion for others through the experience of violence. Moreover, it was also necessary to stabilize the political system and the economy. Looking back into the past was not considered as very helpful. The Soviet occupation zone, and from the 7th October of 1949, the east part of Germany had a different founding story, and it goes like this. German communists created a new, better Germany from ruins with the help of Soviet Union. The certainty of having stood on the right side and suffered during the Nazi regime was, according to historian Andreas Petersen, the moral hinterland of this state. The strong personal continuity also in the east part of Germany, the functional elites, however, was also high. This aspect is similar to the attitude in West Germany. After 1945, it was necessary to look ahead. During her visit to Germany in 1949, Hannah Arendt was surprised how clearly the exclusive view into the future could be felt. As research director of the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, she experienced already the inability to mourn. And that was the idea of the so-called Stunde Null, and the hour zero, the view to the front which regarded the past as closed, just like a cut and a new start. Let's have a look on Turkey. But the context of the Turkish hour zero after the First World War was quite different. On the side of the Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire had to capitulate with its military defeat in 1918. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1919 determined the division of the former imperial empire, for which only an Anatolian territory was left. Around this territory, areas of the west coast were to be under Greek administration. Zones of influence of France and Italy were planned in the south. Kurds were to be granted autonomy in the east, and areas in the southern Caucasus were to fall under Armenian control. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan already date back to this treaty. The re-established Ottoman Sultan also cooperated with the victorious powers, and at British insistence, trials against war criminals took place in Istanbul. You know this much more detailed, I would describe now. The prosecutors spoke of crimes against humanity that had been committed. 17 death sentences were pronounced, of which only 3 could be executed. In view of the Turkish national movement at the beginning of the 1920s, this confrontation with the crime receded into the background. The national movement, organized under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, led to resistance against the Sultan and the military occupation. The end of the First World War in Anatolia led almost seamlessly to the War of Independence, which was joined by numerous former members of the Committee for Union and Progress, and in which the Muslim population was once again mobilized. With the withdrawal of the occupying powers, the Treaty of Sèvres was only partially implemented, and the borders of today's Turkey were defined by the Treaty of Lausanne. Armenians and Kurds did not occur anymore. Italian, French, and Greek zones of influence were no longer provided. The foundation of modern Turkey is based on this successful war of liberation, as it is called in Turkish. After a long war phase, which began with the Tripoli War and the occupation of the Ottoman part of North Africa by Italy in 1911-12, which continued with the disastrous outcome of the Balkan Wars, and led to the loss-making and unsuccessful participation in the First World War, the Republic was now finally victorious. Moreover, the interpretation of Turkish history laid down in Atatürk's famous 36-hour speech in 1927 did not allow to look back. The construction of Turkish history was entirely oriented towards the successful wars of independence and the subsequent founding of the Republic. This historical picture did not foresee any continuity, although the radical group of young Turks shaped the habitus of the Republic far beyond Atatürk's death. Questioning this would probably have to put the stability of the young political system in Turkey at extreme risk. But the unratified Treaty of Sevres remained a symbol, and with the Turkish view, of Armenian Greek immoderacy and imperialist dominance in the anti-imperialist rhetoric of Kemalist nationalism. The repression and denial of the genocide thus served and serves to construe the decline of an imperial empire into a heroic refoundation of a nation-state. So let's have a short conclusion and compare this German-Turkish view. The post-narratives presented here have one thing in common. They have the goal of stabilizing the political system, and thus both have a covering element in relation to the past history of violence in their own country. The victim attitude facilitates this. The situation in Turkey combines the legend of sacrifice and heroism in a way that not only covers up but defends itself, because the preservation of the founding legend also means the forward defense of the nation and the state borders. In Germany, this was politically not possible. A hero legend could hardly be created thanks to the military defeat. The difference lies in the forward defense, I would say, which was and is connected with the idea that the survival of Turkey as a unified nation state was actually at stake at that time. The Kemalist elite had an interest in maintaining a threat perception that would lead the Turks to place a strong and also a militarized state above everything else. Against this background, let us have a look at the historiography directly after the catastrophe. And first again, let's have a look on Germany, and above all, I concentrate on West Germany. For established German historians, 1945 was both a year of continuity and a year of upheaval. The total defeat meant a sharp break, which for them was tantamount to the end of the statehood. And I would like to explain why is that. It were historians who created a legitimizing foundation for the German Empire as a national power state. The founding of the empire was described as telos of Prussian German history. In the face of the Weimar Republic, they remained distant, especially in times of crisis, and in the end, they mostly opted for authoritarian solutions. Despite criticism of the absence of the rule of law, there was little resistance to the Nazi regimes of German historians. Historical scholarship also at that time remained a scholarship of legitimacy for the state. In German history after 1945 was marked by a narrative of crisis. It was a deep caesura in the history of nation and state. German history after 1945 was, the interpretation of these catastrophes was made easier for them. Historians had little to do with the consequences of denazification. I mean, there were only some historians who were kicked out of university, very little. So there were no deep personal cuts. And methodological reorientation has also failed. It was precisely the innovative potential of immigrants that Germany was denied in this field. Research from the USA, for example, was ignored with the argument of lack of empathy. But there were no real alternatives for the arrangement with the situation, so that the guilt for the war was not questioned. Historical research was not a scholarship of revision at that time. The framework conditions didn't allow this, but historians remained defensive for a long time. This, however, laid a historical foundation for the early Federal Republic of Germany, on which Adenauer's Chancellor democracy could unfold. The stabilization of the state was an important goal for the contemporary historians of those years. I mean, I don't know, in Germany we say at that time Bonn, the new capital of West Germany, was not allowed to become Weimar, didn't allow to become Weimar and again. The no longer existence of Jewish neighbors did not have to be denied for this. Not talking about was already enough. The historical study of the Holocaust is a void in the post-war period in Germany. But of course there would have been suggestions. While the perpetrators of the ongoing war tried to hide their deeds by euphemistic language or by even the removal of forensic evidence until the end of the war, the victims often tried not only to be a witness, but also to save evidence of what happened in front of them. For example, the members of the Sonderkommando at the crematorium in Auschwitz, who buried their records in the hope that someday someone could find them. Laura Jokusch has pointed out that the need to write down the suffering immediately or immediately after the liberation was a practice among Eastern European Jews. For example, after the pogroms in the Russian Empire or later the Ukraine, the aim was to record the names and numbers of dead. The Jewish historical commissions founded after the liberation in Austria, in France, Germany and Italy had set themselves the task of documenting the mass murder. Reports were collected through recorded interviews, and the focus was less an individual experience than the need for numbers and facts and the names of the dead and the actions of the perpetrators. Emanuel Ringelblum, to whom we owe the extensive archive on the Warsaw Ghetto, also belonged to this tradition. With the dissolution of the displaced person camps and the founding of the State of Israel, this Eastern European tradition of historiography migrated to the emerging Jewish state. But Jewish historians such as Josef Wolf and Hans Lamm, who deal with the history of persecution, were marginalized in Germany. I mean, that we know these names now, today. I mean, that in the 50s, beginning 60s, nobody was aware of these people. Nicholas Berg rightly stated the conglomerate of disbelief and unwillingness, depression and defense for the immediate German post-war historiography. It has long been known that historians such as Meinecke, Ritter and Kehler defended the tradition of national history by demonizing National Socialism and presenting this as just a misconstruct and mystery in actual German history. And when I say now Meinecke, Ritter, Kehler, I mean you probably don't know this, very normal, but these are the key historians after the war. They also designed some kind of counter-narratives of this kind of different Germany. For example, they emphasized the resistance movement. The early scholarship and overall representations of the Holocaust were written outside of Germany. And just one example, and maybe a famous one, Raoul Hilberg's account that destruction of European Jews was based on his dissertation begun in 1948 and illuminated the wall of the German bureaucracy, and Hilberg, whose parents fled to the USA via France and Cuba in 1938, had access to almost all German files that had been captured by American troops. He completed his dissertation in 1954, and Hilberg describes in his works an almost automatic gradual extermination process which has been jointly organized by the institutions of the NS Society. Hilberg had great problems publishing his work also in the USA. After many attempts and negotiations, it was published by a small publishing house in 1961, and in Germany it was received much later and then later translated, but 25 years later. Just as it is not the case with the Holocaust, and that there were no voices to address the events immediately after the war, it is not the case of the Armenian genocide too. Initially, it were mainly surviving Armenians who collected and published material on the genocide. I won't talk so much about this because, you know much more about this than me. In addition, the memories of the Armenian survivors, for example in Lebanon, Syria or Western countries, have been published in small editions, and it can be assumed that these have been read little and received even less because of language problems. It is not uncommon for these reports also to be ignored because they were considered too subjective, especially because of the war propaganda that prevailed, especially also for the First World War, and because of the strong opposition to Turkish representation. But the period between 1912 and 1922 is the key to the historical self-conception of today's Turkey. The late Ottoman Empire is seen by the conservative and nationalistic part of Turkish historians as a kind of anti-colonial empire, and therefore at the same time as a nation-state surrounded by European imperialism. This contradicts itself, but it works inwardly in the dual role of victim. The imperial empire perished in its tolerance, so this is the Turkish view, and the nation that won at the end against the overpowering European great powers. The Armenian question is treated in few variations as follows, but I just repeat, you are also aware of this. The Armenians were loyal subjects to the Sultan for centuries. Then in times of Ottoman crisis, they were stood up by the imperialist great powers. This culminated during the First World War, when the Armenians sympathized with their enemies and had to be deported out of wartime necessity. Moreover, more Muslims died in the Civil War, in these civil war-like conditions, and there was never a plan to murder the Armenians. And the Turkish state developed professional methods to put this view of history on an academic basis. So again, I will try to make some conclusions of this part. The comparative perspective makes it clear that the post-war period cannot be described only with the words ignoring survivor reports or silence on the subject. But this is often described in the older views of the Holocaust historiography. But we can formulate this much more precisely if we add the Turkish example. If we understand genocide as a concept that goes beyond the killing of human beings, for example, if mass killing goes hand in hand with the construction of ahistorical collective subjects, then denial but also disregard is part of the genocidal process. And what we see in the post-war period is the struggle for memory in the societies created by genocide, in which Armenian and Jewish voices had an extremely bad position in the struggle for memory, precisely because genocide destroys and reorganizes social relations through terror. The fact that this counter-memory has hardly been heard is not just a failure to remember and repress, it is the result of a structure created by genocide which does not cease to exist after the wars and the massacre. It was the goal and it was achieved. And that is also the starting position from which further historiography develops in post-genocidal societies. And now I will come to my next point, the further developments of writing history, and I will start again with Germany. In the second half of the 1950s, a new tone moved into contemporary historical research. National Socialism was no longer interpreted as a dark power which came to the German Empire. Also from the end of the 50s, the pure sacrificial narrative was broken up socially. It was almost a constant development in West Germany about all the big Nazi trials are part of this development. They gained attention and demanded further interpretations. I mean, it was like the Ulmer Einsatzgruppenprozess, the Eichmann-Prozess is maybe more known, and the Frankfurt Auschwitz process from 1963 to 1965. It became clear that not only high-ranking Nazi functionaries were involved, but also normal men who obeyed orders or took initiative. All of this brought to light a different picture than that of totalitarianism-based interpretation that had existed so far. But it was difficult for Germans to explain the Nazi regime beyond this approach. It was even in the 1960s extremely difficult to integrate the bitter truth that the ordinary people, the locals in their regional environment, had participated in the mechanism of persecution and murder, into this concept of memory in Germany. Research into the persecution of the Jews was not anchored at German universities at that time. And only slow did scholarship about the Nazi terror establish itself in West Germany, but it became more and more professional. Slowly, but there were some progress. A clear step was possible through the triumph of social history. In the late 60s and 70s, the debate about functionaries, elites, and profiteers culminated in the well-known dispute between intentionalists and functionalists. I mean, in the question of the actual impulse to the extermination policy. The meanwhile differentiated answers still inspire new debates today, in which, however, multi-causality is accepted. Even though the most important works on Holocaust research in the 60s and 70s were written outside Germany, Dandiner stated that it would be excessive rationalism to ignore the effects of traditional group memory on historiography. It is therefore no surprise that perpetrator research in Germany has become a subdiscipline on its own. Historians, for example, began to investigate, starting with Browning's Ordinary Men, whether such perpetrators, like the members of the police battalions who followed the Wehrmacht to the Soviet Union during the Second World War and shot more than 1 million Jews, were simply unlucky enough to find themselves in a terrible situation, or whether they were perhaps more ideologically motivated than Browning had assumed. Just as multi-causality applies to the impulse of the entire extermination policy, research now also sees the necessity of a multi-dimensional spectrum of perpetrators. In the 1990s, the debate in Germany also became more international and multifaceted, partly because the archives of the former communist countries of Europe were opened for research. And with the new studies, the already old debate between intentionalists and functionalists has been taken up again. And to this day, the question of whether the main cause of the Holocaust was ideology remains an important differentiation criterion of various approaches to historiography. I mean, there are conference discussions about this question. You also find this differentiation in the historiography of the Armenian genocide, even if the development to an internationally embedded research discussion was much slower. The UN Genocide Convention was a starting point that encouraged both Armenians in the diaspora and in the Republic of Armenia to find more representative forms of remembrance of the years 1915 and 16. Interest in the Armenian culture of remembrance remained comparatively low in Western Europe and the USA. The sharp ideological contrast of the Cold War made it possible for Armenia's interest as part of the Soviet Union to be perceived at least as in great need of relativization. This Western European avoidance strategy also withstood the attacks of Armenian militants, which were perpetrated on Turkish diplomats between 1975 and 1986 and were intended, among other things, to draw attention to the denial of genocide. The Turkish government reacted promptly and state-sponsored publications resorted to the narrative which I already described. The Armenian attacks gave the Turkish government reason to hire scholars who constructed continuity lines on the basis of systematic searches in Ottoman sources and attested the Armenians' general tendency to violence. In return, an Armenian narrative developed in the struggle of recognition of the genocide, which was particularly influenced by Armenian American historians. Among the Armenians, there was a feeling that they should take a unified position on genocide. Arguments about the causes of the genocide could thus be interpreted as rationalizations or justifications for mass murder. This historical narrative is characterized by continuity thesis, which links the massacres of the Armenian population at the end of the 19th century with the events of the 20th century and depict the genocide as an expression of a long-cherished fanatical hatred of Christians by Muslims. Basically, it is described that the state did not succeed in dissolving the millet system and to provide by reforms for the equality of the Christian Ottomans. Thus, the scholar works were less about contextualization than about proving the intention and thus the justification for the concept of genocide. And this focus culminated in a comparison with the Nazi crimes. The comparison with the Holocaust served to increase attention in a comprehensible and necessary way. According to critics, however, the purely intentionalist interpretation overestimates the efficiency maybe of the Ottoman state apparatus. Christian has even described this as a real projection, which is a consequence of the comparison of the Armenian murder with the annihilation of the Jewish population by the Nazi regime. The completely contradictory attitudes of the mostly Armenian and Turkish-born scholars were only partially adopted by the international research community. The concentration on their own national history was engraved in university structures as well. There was little room for a global perspective on the First World War. Also, the subject Osmanistic remained for a long time a closed society. And I don't only mean Osmanistic at Turkish universities. It's the same for Osmanistic in, for example, at German universities. And the fast access to the source material and the archives of Turkey were and are subject to restrictions is not possible due to the language difficulties. Moreover, the subject was taboo, strongly influenced by official Turkish historiography. There was an aura of self-censorship that avoided dealing with non-Muslim groups, especially at the end of the Ottoman Empire. So, again, a short conclusion of this part. In West Germany, historical research on the Holocaust took place, albeit with a strong focus on perpetrator research in a system that was becoming increasingly politically and economically stable. It was itself a part of it. Interdependent developments caused by the trials I mentioned, or academic and international debates, but also by, for example, television series, literature, confronted both German society and academia again and again with gaps in the memory. The German Hour Zero was more permanent thanks to the generation dynamic reflection gradually allowed the confrontation with the Second World War and the Holocaust in a democratization society, and this development continues to this day. I mean, it's an ongoing development. And this is different in Turkey. The founding legend still negates the existence of ethnic, religious, and cultural differences between Turkish society. And a glance at the Kurdish population shows what a new interpretation of Turkishness would have for social, domestic, and foreign policy developments. But in Turkey, civil society processes have developed in the meantime, which, among other things, question this way of describing Turkishness as a homogeneous group. The political climate that promoted rapprochement with the European Union through reform measures from 1999 to 2005 and the significant increase in international academic exchange created a basis for questioning this nationalist narrative in Turkey. The transition of the late Ottoman Empire to the Republic of Turkey had thus automatically become the focus of attention, and even though many research projects did not initially deal directly with the Armenian genocide, they nevertheless shed light on the background of the events from 1915-16. The first step towards a lifting of the taboo already mentioned were publications, for example, by Fikret Ademir, Hamid Gosaslan, Fatma Mügecek, and Halil Berktay, and for example also Tana Akşam. But the important thing is that they were widely internationally received. This is the important thing. On this basis, Fatma Mügecek, Gerard Livadian, and Ronald Gisuni initiated the workshop on Armenian-Turkish scholarship in 1998 with several consecutive events that brought Turkish, Armenian, and other international specialists together. The most significant milestone in this development was the conference Ottoman Armenians during the decline of the empire in Istanbul in 2005, and more conferences followed. In the run-up to this conference, the organizers were subjected to harsh criticism. And it must be also said that despite these conferences and discussions in Turkey, the confrontation with the Armenian genocide is still a long way from the curriculum of Turkish universities. But the fact that we know so much more about the years from 1915-16 today is thanks to Turkish, Kurdish and Armenian scholars who did not shy away from uncomfortable arguments in all directions. The extermination of the Armenians in Anatolia also found its way into broader academic investigations via another route. Due to the universalization of the memory of the Holocaust from the 1980s onward and the broad spectrum of the Holocaust studies, comparative genocide research developed rapidly, especially in the Anglo-American region. Its aim is to investigate the individual genocides more closely and to develop also some comparative approaches. And this is now my last point. The influence of genocide studies on research on the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide, discussing on the uniqueness of the Holocaust, continue, albeit not as loudly as in the 1980s and 90s, and it became already more differentiated. Growing literature is looking for ways to place the Holocaust within a larger framework of the history of genocides. It attempts to show to what extent a conceptualization of the Holocaust as a genocide does not mean to relativize the Holocaust or overdraw the characteristics of horror of other events. In contrast to the pioneering work of Armenian historians, the Armenian genocide in the context of genocide studies was not so much a topic also of political aims, but it did anchor this topic definitely in international research. Hans-Lukas Kieser and Dominique Schalland chose a methodologically extensive approach as editors of the anthology The Genocide of the Armenians and the Shoah. And the essays, which do not aim at direct comparison, but are inspired by questions from differentiated Holocaust research, are particularly informative. Donald Roxham describes 1915 as a process of cumulative radicalization, a description known from the historiography of the Holocaust. But how this radicalization took place, how the decision-making process were, how this are to be evaluated, to what extent the so-called triumvirate Talat, Enver, and Cemal Pasha pursued really the same goals, or can we describe Talat really as architect of the genocide, like Hans-Lukas Kieser did this in his recently published biography. This all is under discussion. And even on the basis of less research, the necessity of a comparison between theory and empirical research, which is at the same time always a reflection on the field of historical research itself, arises again and again parallel to the Holocaust scholarship. So it's very similar. If you take the thesis of Fatma Müge-Göçek, that the lack of democratic structure in Turkey is strongly related to the lack of discussing of the history of violence, then we can be somehow more relaxed in Germany. But daring in the public debates, and the tireless explanation of why the deepening view of the past belongs to a democratic constitutional state also remains a task for historians in Germany. And you maybe know we have also now quite right-wing party in Germany, and there's a need to be very clear about this, that this discussions about the past and the deepening view on the past is always necessary. With the comparison I discussed in mind, I believe that a deep understanding of the past is best achieved through international exchange, because this is the only way to really question national narratives. So this is the end. I would like to thank you for listening. Looking forward for comments, questions, additions.
I guess we have many questions. Okay, let's start. Any questions you want to start? Okay, let me start. Use my position and as the first question. What do you think about the methodology of comparison of Armenian genocide and Holocaust? Because for decades we tried to squeeze Armenian genocide in the framework of Holocaust to legitimize maybe Armenian genocide. Vadim Dadarian worked in this way. And do you think is it counterproductive or is it okay to show that Armenian genocide is real genocide? What do you think about this methodology?
I think historians work with the tool of comparison in general. So it's, of course, I believe it's allowed to compare. I mean, the question if the outcome is useful for us, and we can compare also other kinds of mass violence. I mean, there are also studies now. Erik Weiz did this, for example, in the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, and the events in Cambodia. I mean, you can do this, and there are, I think, many interesting aspects to understand. Maybe even mass violence. We don't need to describe it as only as genocide, but the dynamic of mass violence. To compare the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide, like Dadian did, for example, I think at that time it was some kind of necessary for the attention and to bring it up to the international academic discussions. And because at that time when someone said it's similar to Holocaust, it was like, really? I mean, you say this? And it brought attention to it.
What about nowadays scholars? Should we get rid of this
but I think
tradition?
it's not necessary anymore. The Armenian genocide it's also universally accepted in international research. I mean, there are some people maybe, I mean, somewhere at the Turkish university, and maybe also some so-called academicians somewhere in this world, but they are not part of this international academic discussions. So we don't need to care about them, we don't need to argue with them, because they are on a completely different level. So I think we in some way can discuss more freely. And I mean the Holocaust research is so broad and broad, a lot of aspects we should be aware of this when we look at other phenomena of mass violence. So this is very useful. And I think, for example, the economic aspects of the genocide, Armenian genocide, is much faster development research than we did at the Holocaust. And it was a long period we didn't care about the economic relations. So I think that there are some learning process if we look to other research of mass violence.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, responses? Please.
It's interesting to know what do you think about the continuation of the Young Turks genocidal policy during the government of Kemal Atatürk? How you present during your lectures the students this period?
It depends a little bit how much, what kind of focus I have during the talks, and it's a very important part when we only talk about the Armenian genocide. It's important to mention the tension and the violence before 1915, before the First World War. I mean, this concept of war and genocide is a concept we discuss very strongly in the genocide studies. There's always a connection between genocide and war, but I mean, in the Armenian case, there were some events before which showed this extreme tension in the massacres at the end of the 19th century. So when I teach about these topics, this is an important part, and also the time under Atatürk and the founding of the Republic, especially also to explain. I mean, this is a question in Germany. People ask us. It's like, what do you think? It was a genocide or not? I mean, I don't talk about academicians, so I mean, it's easy to answer. And then the second question in Germany is, why do the Turkish people have such a big problem to recognize the genocide? I mean, we did this in Germany so easily, yeah? I mean, what's the problem with them? Yeah, is it just a character? And then, I mean, we focus at this part of the history to explain it, and also the violence which continued.
Other question? Did Mark have something to say?
Well, I think the problem now is with the comparative research that a lot of the Holocaust references coming out of the field of the Armenian genocide is not much more than name dropping. I mean, the comparisons in terms of economy especially, I mean, this is, if you come from Germany and have went to school in Germany in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and then studied with professors of the Holocaust in the 80s, I mean, I don't say that I am up to date, but I mean, when I read this, I feel very uneasy. And I don't give names now. When I talk to the guys, I said, please stop it, this is not even school level what you have. So what we have there is basically a kind of fake comparative approach to the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide on a not even superficial level of knowledge of the Holocaust. So the problem is that if you do the Armenian genocide, you don't know anything about the Holocaust unless you come from a country, mostly exaggerated a little bit to bring the point over, from a country where the Holocaust was perpetrated and is part of, let's say, the curriculum. And you have the same thing in Turkey, where they play with the Holocaust to get out of the genocide link. So basically the Holocaust is now pretty much abused from different sides for obvious purposes. And so there we have a problem, and that points to a shortcoming in the university structure where this has to be better addressed in terms of empirical levels, but also methodological.
There's still the problem that the Holocaust is it's a gold standard of genocide, and we have to get rid of this because we accepted other methods. We already accepted.
It was like latent language in Europe. For example, Armenian old language Karabakh also was artificially squeezed in this system of Latin, and that's why we have some difficulties, some new things just imagined and created to make it more, to make it fit more comfortable from the perspective of Latin language. That's why I think the same with Holocaust.
So you don't have, let's say, a center for Armenians, let's say you don't have a focus on Armenian genocide at a place where it is at the same time a focus on the Holocaust. So for students it's very difficult to get the same place, let's say university, an in-depth empirical training, and then of course also the methodological level. This simply doesn't exist, as far as I can see.
Yes, and he suggested to use this comparison not between two genocides, but to compare different aspects of genocide with different genocides. For example, to compare Armenian genocide deportation with Stalin's deportations, to compare arrest of Armenian intellectuals to Bangladesh case of killing of intellectuals. Not to try to compare two things, trying to identify them, but try to place it in a broader context and see not only two examples but other examples.
I think this helps also. I mean, we as historians probably we are always an expert on the Armenian genocide or the Holocaust or the Khmer in Cambodia, or I mean, this is also already a language problem. Otherwise, you can't work with the sources. But I believe it brings some effect of reflection. For example, to understand the Holocaust or the genocides of the 20th century of some kind of bringing the modality. I mean, modality and genocide is connected. Yeah. But when you have a look at the Rwanda, the ways they killed in 3 months 1 million people. So it's a question, is it really the modality we mean, or should we describe it a little bit more detailed? I mean, it is always a moment of reflection in this comparison. I think this is really good.
Please.
I mean, just coming from outside of history, from a completely different field of research, personally, I don't favor comparisons because I think you have to understand each phenomenon on its own right, what it is. The moment you start to compare, you have a shortfall on what you are actually studying. Then I think in this whole context you have to keep in mind that everything we know about the Holocaust, it's not about studying documents, paper with written words. From the very first moment on, it became personal. It were the survivors who made it personal and the descendants of the survivors who always made it personal. And it's a highly interdisciplinary field of research. So it's not just history, it's not just documents, it's about arts, it's about sociology, it's psychology, it's all these different fields of research who at the same time started to study this phenomenon from different angles. And the sum of all this knowledge is what makes it so broad and what seems to be the big focus on the Holocaust, like the studies on the Holocaust. And if you just come from one angle, just from one field, it will always look smaller. But this is the wrong way to go. It has not only to be international, it has to be interdisciplinary. And I think this is something we have to keep in mind.
Yes, that's correct.
So this is probably also a main problem of historians, because I think that the aim is still to understand the way to mass violence. We would like to understand this. It's maybe the problem.
But you're also a little bit too modest about your own work when you talk about your conferences you organize about Russia, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire, that one gets away from the Eurocentric perspective and basically puts also forms of mass violence and slaughter in these other parts at the same time, and how other bureaucracy were reacting. So how were the Austro-Hungarians reacting to a perceived or claimed revolutionary movement to undermine the Austro-Hungarian Empire? What were the Russians doing, where there was the same thing in their perception? So that is very fruitful because, now from a Armenian perspective, because it shows there was no it wasn't inevitable to have a genocide. There were at the same time, roughly on the Eastern Front of World War I, there were different responses. So that is something, for example, was completely out of my focus, and I only got that through the conferences you organized.
Yeah, and then the important part to compare not the Armenian genocide with the Holocaust, but the kinds of mass violence which were not genocide. I mean, they took a different pattern. So why was that? Yeah, and all the border region and the Multigen Empire, we had quite similar situations.
Yes, and maybe stress more on microhistory, not just trying to see on this from the perspective of geopolitics, on this mega narratives, but just take one case, history of, I don't know, village, history of city, and try to go deeper to that, into the process of...
But the Iranians have failed. If you look, very provocatively, if you look at international literature, Armenian archives do not show up. Yes. If you go through biography, the archives of the Republic of Armenia, be it the National Archives, literature archives, institutes, whatever you have, does not show up. The Georgian National Archives don't show up. That's the history of the Armenian revolutionary movement. So basically, the Turkish historiography has succeeded by default and by accident, and they don't like it, that their archives became now a main focus of genocide research. Basically, they're responsible for it, but they didn't want this way. The Armenians have not succeeded in establishing Armenian as an indispensable resource in terms of language and sources for the study of the Armenian genocide, which is completely absurd.
Yes.
So, and that is basically because the university
but it was because, and Petrushek mentioned, because of denial.
Yeah.
We had to, and the same, the legacy of Davidan. Of course, we glorify him as a founder of Armenian genocide studies, but at the same time, it was because he avoided all Armenian sources, saying that they are too subjective.
That's what he says, but it's not true. He uses Sabah Gülyan all the time without quoting him. Yeah. So that was also, he's not honest. The more important thing is also here in Armenia, you cannot hide behind Davidan. You have to see that Virgin Sevastyan, for decades, worked on her own, being denounced by the Academy as being an Oda, because she's from Egypt, imagine this, and she told me personally, nobody wanted to do genocide, and it was an immigrant, diaspora immigrant issue in Armenia, they brought it up. So there is something wrong, there's a bad heritage from the Soviet Union, and this is something you haven't really, for obvious reasons, the disaster of the 1990s, been able to overcome. So basically these studies, I think now the time has come to start with the studies he spoke of. But it is also a homemade problem.
Yes. But in his new book, Raymond Yerevan used massively Armenian sources. Of course, from Nubar library mainly.
Again, we have to look carefully. He used the microfilms predominantly of the Grigor-Gagarin collection and quoted them as Armenian Patriarchate Jerusalem. Because in the microfilms you have the original archival references. And if you look at the book the work of Grigor-Gagarin, these are in my view the most important historical texts since World War II, his articles. They have now been translated more or less into English and published by a different author. If you look at the illustrations in the book, and if you look at the 1965 publication by Yerevan, they're identical, page by page. The argument is identical, page by page, and if you translate it from the Armenian into English, it's verbatim. So this is, for example, also largely unknown by Armenians. They don't know even their own historians, which is an outcome of the genocide because of the diaspora situation, because of the lack of institutionalization and the lack of discussion. So basically, we deal with the direct outcome of 1915.
But what you said, we need the micro studies. I mean, think that would be the key, and to involve it in this international discussions. I mean, you would
Yes, and it's not only about the religion, it's also about Holocaust. I met Omer Bartov, you know him, of course, and for me, one of the most prominent scholars on Holocaust. I asked him about his ongoing research, and I expected to answers like the complete history of Holocaust or something, he made a thing. But he said, no, I am research the native town or village of my parents, and I want to write history of Holocaust in this one village. So for me it was very...
But this is also this normal waves. I mean, we have phases there where we say like we can't make progress, let's go back to the sources, let's do more empirical research or micro studies. And there's always again a moment like, okay, let's try to summarize it, let's ask ourselves were we on the correct ways 10 years before. There's always a development, and
but also, as your work shows, there's the contradiction. In your conferences, you combine these two levels. You have very precise stuff on individuals, on certain cases, and then you have these like Peter Holquist and so on, or the guys who work on Austro-Hungary when we met the conference, who give that context. So that is there is no real contradiction. It's, I think, the mixture which makes it.
At that conference it was really interesting because I think also the scholars who concentrate on Austro-Hungary, and they were really surprised about the approach and the research on the Armenian genocide, and they learned about this. So that was a very efficient discussion.
Okay. Other questions?
As a researcher and a lecturer, what do you think about creating new methods, new approaches on research of genocide, new epoch of genocide studies, for example?
Yeah, this is a good question. Already brought a very wide perspective to this. I mean, this is also a big problem of the field of genocide studies. I mean, this is a very interdisciplinary field. But I mean, there's also a lack of a method and a really good empirical research, because it is so interdisciplinary and we're working on with so different methods. So it's still, this is a young field of research. Sometimes I have the feeling it's a big mixture. And I think it will need a long time to maybe develop really clear methods to understand mass violence and genocide. It's still something to study.
Perhaps on a practical level, for Armenia, you have to, as a researcher, you have to know one archive well. You need an empirically sound basis in one archive, because when you go through the archive, you go through methodological problems, how to deal with the sources. This gives you the tools for evaluation and also for comparison. If you don't go down to the bottom, you always are somehow up in the air, not quite on the ground, not quite up there. If you have that one, that would be, I think, for a lecturer very important. You have to do it once thoroughly. And you have the stuff here, you don't have to go anywhere else, you just need the subway.
The last question maybe, a month ago I was in Yad Vashem, and then 10 days, and all scholars I met there, they tried to avoid term Holocaust.
Because we say
Holocaust, yes. Do you think about this changing of this definition, this term? Why? And in your presentation you titled not Holocaust but Shoah. Was it just what it was?
Yeah, I mean, Shoah is the expression the Jewish people created, and they prefer this. And it depends a little bit where I talk. Holocaust is the more common name in Germany. I say Holocaust because sometimes they are in academic situations not, but they probably are a little bit irritated when I say Shoah, so it depends always on the context I use it. If you ask me what's the best, it's Shoah, because
Until 1978, it was the Völkermord, the killing of the Jews in Germany, then came the Holocaust series from the US, and the Holocaust was established as a term. That's why the Germans of our generation now use the word Holocaust. It was before, there was no Holocaust before 1978. As a broad term, it would have been understood. I didn't understand, I was 16 years old, one had to explain to me what Holocaust means.
And so it is also difficult to describe Holocaust as a genocide. As you know, we have a genre of genocide research and we have a genre of Holocaust and genocide. So this is something different. Yeah, it's a different approach.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
Discussion.